Shabbat Shalom, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to another sermon here at Nazarene Way Church. We are an emerging church growing from the grassroots freaking level. You're going to be able to see it as you view the YouTube history. From us going from just like back in the first church of the Nazarenes, the Jerusalem church, they were held, in houses. The synagogues were started in houses. And so Jesus's earliest followers and the leader of the Jerusalem church, Jesus's brother, James the Just, and to catch you up to speed, yes, Jesus had biological brothers, and the roster of them are listed out in the Gospels. And you can find it, for instance, the earliest written Gospel, which is Mark. You can find it in the Gospel of Mark, the roster of Jesus's four brothers and two sisters who, not surprisingly, go unnamed. Anyway, welcome back to another sermon here at the Nazarene Way Church. And just to catch you up to speed, before I even jump into it, I'm actually going to do something, and that is exactly what Jesus's brother James did, and Jesus himself probably did, is whenever they entered church and went into a state of prayer, they put a shawl or a hood or something from their cloak on their head to cover their head. And that is outlined in the Hebrew Bible. And it is also, where the concept of the yarmulkes came from. In fact, the yarmulkes was essentially created in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th centuries. So it's something that was created after the death of Jesus, whose real name was Yeshua in Aramaic, Yeshua of Nazareth. And, that's why they wear yarmulkes, is to essentially consecrate themselves, separate themselves off and say, God is above me. My head is not essentially worthy enough to touch God. I need to, essentially add a shawl or something on my head, especially when it comes to prayer. So, you know what? That's what we're going to do today, ladies and gentlemen. And in case you're wondering, is the Nazarene Way Church, is it Christian? Is it Jewish? What is it? It is not Christian. We follow the same exact religion that Jesus the Nazarene, Jesus of Nazareth, followed. And he was of the Judean sect, a group known as the Nazarenes. And so we are essentially going back, forking time back, and resurrecting and restoring the true practices, the true nature of Jesus's original religion before a man who was not from Jerusalem, who never met Jesus, who says and claims, just like Joseph Smith of the Mormons claims, that he had an apparition, a sight of Jesus 7 years after Jesus' death. That man is named Paul of Tarsus, who invented something called Christianity, Gentile Christianity. And what we are doing is we are restoring the true way. It's called the Nazarene Way. And you can see this, actually this term, the way, people of the way, or disciples of the way, emerge if you read the quote-unquote New Testament, which is a term that Jesus never used. Read the New Testament, read Acts of the Apostles, and you will see the terms like the way and people of the way, followers of the way. Anyway, what we believe here at Nazarene Way Church and what Nazarenes believe is really quite simple. We go back to what Jesus said. And we have this account of what he said across many different pieces of literature, not just the New Testament, but other external sources as well, even sources considered apocryphal in the eyes of 3rd, 4th, and 5th century crazy, heretical declaring individuals that essentially formed something known as the Catholic Church. And that is this. What we believe is the two most important commandments, as said by Jesus, is to, number one, love the Lord God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. And number two is to love your neighbor as yourself. Now, Jesus also followed the 10 Commandments, the Torah, the laws of Moses. And we also know for a fact that Jesus said in Matthew that he did not come to abolish the Torah. He did not come to abolish the Judaism faith and the ways of the Hebrew Bible. He came to fulfill it. And yet here we find an individual known as Paul that if you want to see all of the contradictions between Paul and Jesus, simply watch one of my sermons where I say the great contradictions, and I outlined the great contradictions of Paul versus the words that Jesus said, which directly contradict one another. One other core tenet that we believe here at the Nazarene Way Church is that action matters over faith. And it's quite crazy and odd that that is such a profound and provocative statement these days. To say that action and your actual deeds matter more than you just walking into some Southern Baptist church after you fart away a hamburger at Applebee's and declare, I have faith in Christ Jesus, and all of a sudden you are all forgiven. And then you go and say racist crap at home and just hate other people and don't actually live in the way of Jesus the Nazarene. What did Jesus the Nazarene actually do? Well, he believed that action matters just as much, if not more, than faith. And we can see this in the letter of James, which is a letter that actually makes its way into essentially almost the very end of the New Testament, next to Jude. Jude is also a brother of Jesus. Jude is short for Judas. They call him Jude because, Judas has such a bad rap to it because of Judas Iscariot, right? Who, essentially handed over Jesus to Caiaphas, who, is blamed for the death of Jesus, even though it's probably just as much, if more so, Pontius Pilate. Anyway, here's what we're going to do today. We're going to continue in our quest of going through a fantastic book by Robert Eisenman called James, the Brother of Jesus, because his core tenet and his core premise that he outlines is that if you want to actually understand Jesus, then look to his brother, James the Just. James was essentially inserted as the leader of the Jesus movement after the death of Jesus the Nazarene. And we find this. He was the primary pillar. There was 3 pillars of Jerusalem. His right-hand man was Peter, Simon, otherwise known as Cephas, which means rock, and John the Apostle. And what's interesting is Catholics have tried their very hardest to essentially write out and diminish and dismiss and almost hide and overlook and not even talk at all about James. People don't know who James is. The Catholic Church, from what I can recall, I have never, to my recollection, remembered a Catholic Church Mass, which James is primarily taught as the central figure. What's odd is Catholics are so obsessed with the concept, the later mythological invention of the virgin birth and Virgin Mary, which we don't find in the earliest written gospel, which is Mark. We don't find in any of Paul's writings even. We don't find in the Gospel of John. It was essentially a later incantation to try to fulfill incorrectly a reading of Isaiah 7:14. What's also interesting is the entire idea of the perpetual virginity of Mary comes from an apocryphal gospel of the ascent of James, which is also interesting. So the Catholics can't really get it straight. What do you believe that in the concept of perpetual virginity of Mary, that she was always a virgin, that she gave the virgin birth? Okay, you do. Then why do you declare the primary source in which you got that core belief to be apocryphal, to be not part of the canon, which is the ascent of James? It's really quite absurd. Anyway, what we're going to do here is we're going to continue on through I'm going to see if I can find the spot. We're going to continue on through a survey of Robert Eisenman's. Let's see here. Let's see if I can find this actual spot, because it's very fascinating. I have to share this part with you. Might be able to pull it up right here. There's a section that I want to show you. What I have in my hands is the pseudo-Clementine literature, which, just to be quite clear, the concept of pseudo is inserted in there. In fact, every single one of um, the Gospels are technically pseudo. We don't actually know who wrote the Gospel, so they're kind of pseudo. Besides Luke, Luke actually attests inside of his Gospel that that he wrote the Gospel of Luke. Probably he kind of it was a Gentiled version of Matthew, which was most commonly used by the Hebrews, which is actually probably based on the Gospel of the Hebrews, which shockingly was the Gospel of Matthew minus the first 2 chapters, which included the lineage, the long lineage list, and also the whole nativity story and the concept of the virgin birth, which, I don't know, shows that it's probably the whole virgin birth idea is a later invention. We believe, the Nazarenes and the Ebionites, we believe that Jesus actually became the Son of Man, which is Ben Adam, at the baptism of John the Baptist. Okay? Anyway, here's what we're going to cover right now. On page 210 of Robert Eisenman's book, James, the brother of Jesus, he actually points something out that I want to share with you, and that is that the attack and death of James outlined in the Pseudo-Clementines is likely more accurate than Hegesippus and Eusebius's account. Okay? And I want to also point something out too. Robert Eisen makes this interesting observation that Acts of the Apostles and also Pseudo-Clementines, there's so many pieces of overlapping material in which both texts, the Acts of the Apostles and the Pseudo-Clementines, were likely pulling from and using some similar or the exact same origin source. And in fact, the Pseudo-Clementines get the source material, looks like a little bit more accurately communicated and portrayed, which is an interesting observation here. Now, I want to point something out here, and that is this, is I'm going to read to you a passage from the Pseudo-Clementine literature. It's essentially the Clementine literature, which was, I believe, written in maybe the earliest account is of what we have is maybe the 3rd century, like the 200s, right? And when you read through this, it is very clear that it seems like there has been a deliberate attempt by some external authority, perhaps maybe the early church fathers or Catholicism or something, to almost relegate and cast aside the Clementine literature such that it is not taken seriously as a historical document or a historical source. But when you read it, the narrative and how it reads is no less historical sounding and seeming than, for instance, the Gospels and other New Testament texts other than the epistles and the letters. So here's what I'm going to share with you. I'm going to give you a reading of one of the parts that Robert Eisenman points out. And it starts with this. We're going to skip the first two. I'll read the first 2 sentences, even though they are not really that profound or interesting. But just for the sake of you knowing I'm not trying to pull a fast one on you, I'm just going to read the entire section to you. And what I'm about to read you is an interesting section in which Paul essentially attacks James, the brother of Jesus. James is the leader and the bishop, the first bishop of the Jerusalem church. And so here it goes. And when matters were at that point that they should come and be baptized, some one of our enemies entering the temple with a few men began to cry out and to say, "What mean you, O men of Israel? Why are you so easily hurried on? Why are you led headlong by most miserable men who are deceived by Simon, a magician. This is Simon Magus they're talking about, who was some charlatan, essentially, that would, say, hey, basically, come follow me, come donate to me, I'll do some magic for you, okay? While he was thus speaking and adding more to the same effect, and while James, the bishop, was refuting him, he began to excite the people and to raise a tumult, so that the people might not be able to hear what was said. Therefore, he began to drive all into confusion with shouting, and to undo what had been arranged with much labor, and at the same time to reproach the priests, and to enrage them with revilings and abuse, and like a madman, to excite one to murder, saying, "What do you? What do you?" And so what he's saying is, this individual who, it's not Simon, the magician, some unnamed enemy of James, while James was trying to defend himself and refute all of the claims by this nameless enemy, aka, and we have many accounts of Paul and James getting into it in Galatians, in Acts, and we have evidence of Paul being reprimanded. So who is this unnamed individual? And this unnamed individual is causing chaos. He says, "What do you hesitate, O sluggish and inert? Why do we not lay hands upon them and pull all these fellows to pieces?" He's talking about James and the Nazarenes. When he had said this, he first, seizing a strong brand from the altar, set the example of smiting. Then also others, seeing him, were carried away with like readiness. Then ensued a tumult on either side of the beating and the beaten. Much blood is shed. There is a confused flight, in the midst of which that enemy, who is that enemy? It's talking about Paul here. It's called the tumult raised by Saul, is this chapter, in which that enemy attacked James and threw him headlong from the top of the steps, and supposing him to be dead, he cared not to inflict further violence upon him. So that's interesting, because he was thrown headlong by Paul, and we also have evidence, and we see that James was essentially killed, and we have this account from Josephus. In James, it's we have an account from external sources saying that he was thrown essentially off of the Temple of Jerusalem. So who threw him? Well, from the pseudo-Clementines, it makes it seem like it was indeed Paul. And when you go through the quote-unquote Clementine recognitions in literature, you find so many things in here. And you have to ask yourself, did someone in the 2nd century, in the 3rd century, in 200, 220, when the early Nazarene movement was still kind of figuring out its identity, right? And it was essentially at that point might have been branching and merging into being known as the Ebionim, the Ebionites, which are the poor ones. Where does this come from? Did someone just make up out of nowhere that Paul killed James, the brother of Jesus, James the Just? I think not. I think where there's smoke, there's fire. And what we know is that Paul was preaching a completely different gospel. He did not know who Jesus was. He never met him. He claims to have met him. And yet we find that all of the people who walked with Jesus, who knew his teachings and lived with Jesus, grew up with Jesus, followed James, the brother of Jesus, James the Just. And so, therefore, I want to wake you up to something, and that is, it is important that you open your eyes and read with a critical eye, because the New Testament and the Bible, quote-unquote Bible that you're reading, is not the Bible of Jesus the Nazarene. It is not the Bible of Jesus. It is the Bible of Paul. It is the Bible of a carbon copy of what Eisman talks about, of Paul, who Paul invented this term and this character known as Christ Jesus, which is a carbon copy of Paul. It is not an actual carbon copy of Jesus the Nazarene, the man who believed that you should love God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, to love your neighbor as yourself, and above all, blessed are the poor ones, to care for and take care of the Ebionites, the Ebionim, the poor ones. That is the true gospel that I encourage you to follow. And unfortunately, more and more, that is being lost and not found in Christianity. So with that said, I invite you to live and walk and act in the way that Jesus, James, and the apostles and those who knew him acted and walked. And that is to take care of the Ebionites, the poor ones. That's it for today. Peace and love. I'll see you next week, and Shabbat Shalom.